Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Caroline Raes. I am a Senior Program Manager at the Global Resilient Cities Network. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 23rd speaking series, Cities on the Frontline. Today's session will focus on public transport new operating norms and how cities can adapt and make their public transport systems more resilient in the face of the pandemic. Before I turn it over to Badr Mehta from the World Bank, our co-host, who will introduce today's speakers, I'd like to quickly remind. Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll continue, sorry. So yes, before I turn it over to Badr Mehta, who will introduce the speakers, I'd like to quickly remind everyone of the purpose of these sessions and some ground rules. So the Cities on the Frontline sessions are designed as a safe space for practitioners from cities and partners who are helping them to respond and recover from the coronavirus to come together, share knowledge, and learn. So the sessions are not on the record. So if you want to publish any information shared by the speakers, please make sure you reach out to us and we will make sure we put you in touch with them to get their permission. We're very pleased to have close to 190 participants joining us today from all over the world. There will be an opportunity for some interaction with the speakers, so please make sure you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to type your questions throughout the session, and if possible, also please indicate which speaker you'd like to get a response from. And if you'd just like to say hello and introduce yourself, you can also drop a quick note in the chat box at the bottom. And with that, I will turn it over to Badr to introduce the speakers. Badr, the screen and mic is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Hello, welcome everybody to this webinar. It's the 23rd in the series. This is jointly organized by GRCN and the World Bank. I represent the World Bank. I'm a lead urban specialist, and I'm based for the last couple of weeks from Singapore, but I was based in China for the last 4 years. With that, let me go straight into introducing our two excellent speakers. The first speaker is going to be Flores Bachraman. He works at AT Osborne in the Netherlands, and he has extensive experience in designing and implementation of infrastructure in smart mobility programs and projects. And his work covers the public and private organizations. He has also worked on PPP in mobility strategies, innovative performance procurements, and in that wide sphere. Our second speaker is Professor Chris Nash. He's a research professor at the Institute for Transport Studies at Leeds University in the UK. He has spent many years as the director of the ITS, and he has coordinated major international research projects on rail regulations and infrastructure charging for the EU and the Community of European Railways. And he has worked on many rail transport projects across Australia, China, and South Korea. And so with that, I'll ask Floris to present, and then he will be followed by Professor Chris Nash. So Floris, it's all yours.
Thank you, Badr, and on behalf of the World Bank, and thank you, Caroline, on behalf of GRCN, for inviting me and sharing some thoughts and best practices and personal experiences during this Cities on the Frontline event. And let's start to get my screen right. There you go. Well, thank you again for having me, and to all of you online, welcome to this speaker session as well on behalf of me as well. And I will try to discuss from a more practical point of view some of COVID-19 impact experiences in the public transport, but also on the wider mobility system in the Netherlands. Well, first, thank you, Badr, for your extended introduction. Well, like you said before, my role is basically being a consultant, and over the last years I've been lucky to gain a lot of experience in the resilient and integrated mobility systems projects and programs across the Netherlands. And my role basically is connecting and committing public, private, people, projects, and programs to get things done. And in my opinion, getting a variety of all these stakeholders on board is key to battle our challenges regarding accessibility, livability, but also resilience strategies, and of course, dealing with COVID-19 as well. Well, I'm really forward to share my thoughts, and like you were mentioning before, Caroline, please, I'm really interested in your thoughts and experiences from across the world, so don't hesitate to ask a lot of questions via the live chat, and after Chris's presentation, I think we'll come back and hopefully can answer some of your questions as well. But without any further ado, let's start. Like I was mentioning before, I will focus on the impact of COVID-19, not only on the transport sector, but also on the wider mobility sector in the Netherlands as well. And hopefully we are in a sort of recovering phase right now, and in which we try also from a government perspective maybe, but also transport provider perspective, to facilitate the structural change that has been going on over the last months regarding shifts in our mobility behavior. And I believe that not only governments and transport providers, but also employers are at stake to make sure that we as end users or travelers or commuters to our work, get into a new normal as well. I will start off with some facts and figures in the Netherlands. The chart above shows actually the development of Corona and the lockdown, and hopefully we are in the Netherlands, we are sort of in a restart phase right now, and hopefully we can avoid a second or third wave of infections and stay sort of open and won't face any more lockdowns. But in the end, we don't know really how long this period is going to take, but in the end we will get to a sort of, after Corona, hopefully new normal in which we do things more efficiently and effectively. Coming back to traffic data figures, what is very striking is in the Netherlands, traffic data is almost back to pre-Corona levels. And of course, we're still in our holiday seasons in Europe here as well, but we expect some further growth of these figures after the holidays are over. But what is, of course, and that's what this series is about, is the public transport sector. It was down to only 10% in April, but by the mid of July, passenger figures went up by, are almost at 50% right now, but still 50% is not 100%. So that means that actually the Dutch government has, 1.5 billion bailout just to support these public transport operators in the Netherlands, just to get things going. And we see the model shift from public transport to cars, cycling, that's of course a very Dutch thing, walking, but also a lot of working from home. And at the same time, that was really interesting. We see a big rise of shared e-bikes and e-scooters going on, not only in the big cities, but also in the smaller towns. But in the end, how do we make sure that this Corona will be not only a hurdle, but also an accelerator for, structural behavioral change? And, to demonstrate some more figures here, is actually what I've said in my previous slides. You can see it starts March, everything is on 100%, and you see that the yellow line is the public transport line. That's really down, but it's still the 1st of July, because after July 1st, a lot of things eased in the Netherlands, so those figures are rising. But as you can see, there's a lot of cycling going on, which was already big, and walking. And that's just a figure. I think it's sort of similar to other cities in the world. And if you look, and because this is public transport, this is a chart that shows the train capacity. Everything was scaled down when the lockdown started, but around 1st of May, the trains are, we're going back to normal services. And what you see right now, that of course the trains are back almost to 100%, but the passengers are only 50%. And what is very striking, what you see, we don't have, because there were some capacity problems in trains during rush hours, And of course, we have to remain and keep our distances and wearing our masks. But what you see is that a lot of people work from home and travel not during rush hours, but in between rush hours or before and after. So there are hardly any rush hours anymore in the public transport in the Netherlands. The same kind of figures are well hold for other modalities, but this is for the trains in the Netherlands. My next slide, well, I was talking about the financial impact for the public transport sector, and I was already mentioning the 1.5 billion euro bailout, and that's only for the Netherlands, a country of, well, 16, 17 million people, and only for this year. And that is only the 1.5 billion, not million, billion is only for actually the exploitation of these services, and not so much about the employee cost. And we look at the right side of this slide, you see that also the Dutch government is also investing a lot in sort of financial employee support to get all those people on board and not make sure that those people will lose their jobs. And I have sort of circled the organization. We are the top receiver, the receivers of money. You see that a lot of transport organizations are involved. And the red ones are more the public transport authorities in the Netherlands, and you see a lot of dots of circles there as well. So a lot of money goes into make sure that the public transport will be running. My presentation, well, this was about the figures, but what I want to show you is some practical examples of, well, that the Dutch were already taking some steps to structurally change their transport and mobility system in a more resilient one. However, the corona is, well, we didn't expect any corona coming to us, but as an acute compelling event, further urges and accelerates some of the developments that were already, well, going on. And the first one is a focus on a more integrated area, integrated mobility system approach. The second one is a shift from the more old-fashioned public transport concessions towards more integrated mobility concessions. And the third one is getting employers on board and to make sure, because they have a big stake in how people travel and if they travel, and if they travel, that they don't travel during rush hours. And I will show just some well, three cases to illustrate. The first one showcases the Brainport Eindhoven case. That's a business park to run that's located in the southern part of the Netherlands. This area is also, well, or despite the corona crisis, it really flourishes, and that means the economic development, but also the impact on the mobility is enormous. For example, the site, the business park where ASML, that's a large semiconductor company, that company will grow from 12,000 to 17,000 employees. So that's a big growth in just 2 years. And that, of course, impacts the accessibility, sustainability issues, and livability issues, not only on the site, but also on the surrounding areas. And of course, COVID-19 comes in, so that means something as well. And what is special about this case, that public and private, public authorities, but also private companies like ASML has decided, hey, we can't do it on our own anymore. We have to work together. So they set up a sort of public-private deal in which both parties, and there are a variety of parties, public-private parties, invest in a lot of measures that contribute to the mobility and transport system. And that's very interesting, a new thing to do. And what is, well, to come back to this integrated area approach, of course, and the big circle, the thick line is the area where the site of the Run Business Park. Of course, when you take measures regarding new bus lines or installing new bikes or e-bike scooters, of course, that will affect the wider environment as well, and the wider area. And on the other hand, measures taken in the other surrounding areas of this site automatically impact developments in this site. So this area and all projects and programs involved are not only focusing on measures taken on the specific business park site, but on the wider area and vice versa. And the second one is the integrated mobility system approach, because in my opinion, it consists of 4 layers. And it's not only about public transport, that's very important, but to get a real change and get a real shift in how we travel and to make it more effective and efficiently, it's important to have, of course, infrastructure and smart hubs in place, but also have connected intelligent transport systems like smart traffic lights in place. And besides the public transport, we need first and last services like bikes and e-scooters, etc. And in the end, you need mass providers or mobility providers to let all these different layers work together. And if you look at this project or this case, all short, mid, and long-run measures are taking place not only on the site but in the entire area, and also not only public transport or not only shared vehicles or whatever. No, all projects and programs take place on all those 4 different layers. The second showcase regarding the shift from public transport concession towards more smart integrated mobility concession is also an example in the southern parts of the Netherlands. I work for several client organizations there, so that's why I'm showcasing these examples. And well, the first question that arises: how much actually changed over the last 150 years? You see horses with a carriage behind it, and then you see a bus, and then the picture below is a self-driving electronic bus. But in the end, it's still sort of the same kind of vehicle. And of course, Corona, well, automatically impacts an extra 1.5 million bailout in the Netherlands alone. And that also, well, sort of new questions arise: how resilient is our public transport system anymore? And that's not new, because I think, like in the rest of the world, we are thinking about how can it be more effective, more efficient. But in the end, there are several dilemmas: economic versus inclusiveness and resilience. And in the end, these are political choices. And at the same time, you see a lot of new developments, like much more mobility on demand and mobility as a service, self-driving vehicles, etc. And that means that when we are Dutch governments are granting a new public transport concession, they were thinking, no, this is not the way to do it. We have to do it differently. And one of the first examples in the Netherlands will be a concession in the western part of the North Brabant region, and that will come into effect by 2022. And as you can see on the images on the right side, the traveler is the central piece, and the concession will not about only buses, trams, or metros, but will be on, hey, how can I go best from A to B, or should I work from home? Maybe that's a better option, but also that includes first and last miles, self-driving vehicles, etc. And in the end, you need the infrastructure as well. In this case, a mobility hub, for instance, to make sure that people can make these new choices as well. The last one is the impact via employers. And what you see a lot is that employers, in the end, as lasting customers, really could facilitate and stimulate a lot of development where we already facing the last month, and that's working from home, spreading working hours, or other measures we sort of getting more used to over the last month. And what is very interesting, hey, how can we make sure that these changes will be more structural? And in the end, employers as lasting customers could have a big role and impact on these developments. And for that reason, the Dutch government will start a very large campaign that is focused on employers, not so much on employees or other parties, to make sure that, hey, there's something in for you as an employer as well to stimulate these kind of developments. Why should they do that? Well, in the end, money is, especially for employees, something that talks as well. And PricewaterhouseCoopers has recently published a study that, that actually shows that only one extra day working from home saves at least 4 billion euros each year in the Netherlands. And now I'm talking about only 1 day a week working from home. And if you go more into detail, then employers will save 1.7 billion euros a year because of the reasons behind like less housing costs, less catering costs, etc. But also employees will save a lot of money because they don't have to commute as much and therefore save costs as well. And besides the benefits for employers and employees, a lot of environmental savings, you can monetize them as well, because, well, less travel means less pollution. So that means if you monetize that, for the Netherlands, about 700 million each year, because there are less, sort of compensation or mitigation projects or programs have to be into place to compensate for that pollution. And of course, there are a variety of societal benefits as well. For instance, less commuting means less cost for development, but also the maintenance of infrastructure. It also impacts physical and mental health, etc. So there's a lot to gain to make these changes more structural. That is it. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any further questions, please ask them via the chat or contact me via these. You see my contact info, so don't hesitate to contact me. So that was it. Thank you so much. Back to Caroline or Bajor.
Hello, well, I'm Chris Nash. You've seen from my title, as research professor, what that implies is that I'm semi-retired. I've spent about 45 years researching public transport, but I've never seen anything like the current crisis. So I look forward to other people's comments on where we're going, because there's not much past experience to rely on. So I'll talk particularly about British experience. What I'm going to do is to start off talking about what's happened in the short run, where we've seen a big limitation of capacity on public transport due to social distancing. For many months, the government and the operators were appealing to people to only make essential journeys. And we've certainly seen a big rise in home working, in teleconferencing, replacing business meetings, and a collapse in public transport use. But the really interesting question, and the one that I don't know the answer to, is to what extent these changes are permanent. Will we simply get back to the normal in a few months or a year or two, or is this a start of a totally new period in terms of public transport? So I just picked data for 2 days here. The 1st of April, these days are generally typical, except cycling, I'll mention. So the 1st of April, we were in lockdown. People were being asked to work at home wherever possible. Only shops selling necessities were open. People were being told not to make journeys unless they were really essential. And you can see what happened. Car traffic was at about 1/3 of its norm. Rail, the Underground in London, were about 5% of their normal level. Bus was 10–15%, a bit higher in London than elsewhere. And cycling went up. By the 27th of July, we'd unlocked to a considerable degree. Shops were open, restaurants were open. A lot of people were back at work. Schools are still closed because schools will open largely in September. Would have been summer holiday anyway by then. Car traffic had largely recovered to 80% of what it was a year before. Rail was back to 20–25%. Bus was back to 30–45%. Cycling, I think 27th of July must have been a wet day, because actually cycling generally was still up. So this collapse in traffic, of course, as in the Netherlands, the government had to step in with major financial support to public transport operators. And the change that meant in Britain was quite dramatic, because our bus services, ever since 1986, have been to a large extent provided by commercial operators without general subsidy, although they do get some benefits, and without local authority control. It is a bit different in London, where buses run under contracts to Transport London. Our rail services were pretty well all franchised to the private sector, but with the private sector bearing revenue risk. So the shift to a position where essentially everything was running on contract to the government and being paid for by the government was a dramatic one, and we don't know to what extent that might be permanent. Will private operators actually be willing to take revenue risk again, and certainly not in the near future? And there are already moves towards having more of a concessioning system for both rail and bus, which I think COVID-19 may have accelerated. Okay, I mentioned the problems of capacity. Early on in the crisis, the rule introduced by government was that people should remain 2 meters apart. And public transport operators were required to respect that. And that meant that, as in this case, this is a single-decker bus. I don't know, it would probably normally take 45, 50 passengers seated and 20 standing. It was restricted to carry 11 passengers. You can see how the seating is arranged. Double-decker would typically take 20. So buses and trains were both reduced to carrying certainly less than 25%, and in some cases no more than 10% of their normal. Oh, and standing was not permitted, as in the peak. We have a lot of standing passengers on public transport. So this was a tremendous reduction in capacity. That has been eased since. The rule now is public transport passengers must wear a mask, but should still remain 1 meter apart. Generally, that means something like 50% of seats now can be filled, but still no standing. So it's still a reduction to less than half the capacity in normal times. And clearly, we don't know how long this is going to continue. Is it actually going to continue until until a vaccine is widely available, or will the level of the virus be reduced enough that these rules can be eased before then? But while we have these constraints, this is a catastrophe for public transport. The unit costs have more than doubled, in effect, because of the capacity being halved. And whilst there's some scope for increasing numbers of buses, there's very little scope for increasing numbers of trains. Our systems, certainly around London and to a fair extent around the other big cities, were already running at capacity. So we simply cannot carry anything like the volume that we were before, as long as these restrictions remain in place. The other feature of this period was a clear appeal from central government only to use public transport if you had no alternative and if it was absolutely essential. So these are the sorts of notices you found at your local railway station. And that, again, that message has been eased. That was the case for something like 4 months, that the government was saying only use public transport if absolutely essential. If possible, use another mode. If you have a car, use your car rather than catching public transport, which is a message I never expected to hear from a government in my life. As I say, that message has been eased somewhat, but there are still warnings that with the reduction in capacity, you may well be left behind by your bus or train. For trains, you're strongly advised to reserve a seat wherever that's permitted. And there are still really discouraging messages regarding the use of public transport. Now, I think this has largely been because of the worry at the reduced capacity that we had to discourage people from using public transport to avoid overcrowding or leaving lots of passengers behind. But there is a real worry that this has also given out the message to the public that public transport is not safe. But following the pandemic, public transport is best avoided. Now, will the traffic come back? Well, my experience is that of past crises is public transport traffic recovers remarkably quickly. So this is just rail. Rail has been growing sharply in Britain. There have been various crises. The worst was probably following a fatal accident at Hatfield in 1980, when there was a big panic about the state of the rail infrastructure, leading to severe speed restrictions, doubling journey times. Many people said, well, this is the end for rail. People will find other ways of travelling. This disruption went on for months, but as soon as the system was running normally again, it took very little time for the traffic to come back. We've had other major things, major disputes. Really, all you see in this graph is small kinks. You don't see any of these things leading to a collapse in rail. Indeed, even the financial crisis of 2008 really only small kink rather than reduction. So I would say past experience suggests people fairly rapidly return to their previous behaviour. But a few concluding comments. Clearly, the sort of disruption we've seen in the past has never been anything like what we are now going through. So past experience may not be that good a guide. As I say, as long as social distancing is regarded as necessary, public transport capacity is massively reduced and unit costs massively increased. There are fears that the image of public transport as a safe mode may have been damaged long term. And then there's the whole issue of telecommunications. Now, again, my reading of the research is that in the past, developments in telecommunications have not tended to reduce travel, may even have boosted it. What seems to happen is people take on board new technologies, so the big growth of email and the earlier growth of teleconferencing enabled people to build up much bigger networks of contacts, carry on much more communication with more people, but actually still wanted to meet face-to-face from time to time, and with the big increase in contacts, maybe even that boosted travel. But the big question now, I guess, is whether the alternatives to travel are now so much more attractive than they ever were before. The amount you can now do from your laptop at home, as I am right now, was unthinkable even a very few years ago. So have people discovered ways of working they never dreamed were possible? I should say there was already a clear trend amongst London commuters in particular towards working at home 1 day per week. So it may have just reinforced that. That trend has created some problems for public transport operators in terms of their finances, but obviously in a wider social context, may be a quite desirable thing. But again, whether these trends will be accelerated by COVID-19, there have been surveys suggesting that public transport use may remain 20% roughly lower than before the pandemic, even when we get back to some sort of normal. But these surveys are based on asking people what they will do, and we know that that's unreliable. We know that people tend to answer that they will change their behaviour more than actually happen, settle back into their old routines. So what we have is then a very serious crisis for public transport in the short term. Really a lot of uncertainty as to what this means for the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Floris, and thank you, Professor Nash, for your very insightful presentations and your insights on the experience of the Netherlands and the UK. We'll now go into the more interactive part of the session, and we'll try to answer some questions. There's a first question that's directed to you, Floris, that talks about the savings and environmental benefits that you've mentioned from working from home. This is a question from Manish, who asks, will these benefits help in investing in electric public transport and subsidized fees for low-income passengers or residents?
There's several questions in one. Thank you for the question. I don't know about the exact figures, but in the end, of course, scaling helps making these kind of developments more attractive. In general, there's relatively a lot of also already financial support for driving electric cars, scooters, etc. But in the end, it's a very interesting question, because in the end, electric cars or other modalities are expensive. And it's true, if we want to make sure as a society that it will be available for all income groups, then in the end, maybe a little bit more money needs to get into it. And that in the end is a political decision, I suppose. But interesting question. Thank you.
You know, there was a poll, and the poll results suggest that all the participants believe, or a majority of the participants believe, that it's the city authorities who should be making the rules for public transport as opposed to central government or others. So what would be the two speakers' views about this? What is the role of the city level authorities in making rules for how public transport could be used? Floris, you go first.
Another good question. I think in the end there will always be a public role and stake in, because it's called public transport. But I was mentioning in my presentation that you see a shift towards more demand-driven instead of supply-driven, a demand-driven, on-demand-driven mobility system, in which also the public authorities not only should, but also have to work together with other public and private parties to get all these new developments into place. So I believe, of course, public authorities should always be in place to guarantee some basic, accessibility, sustainability issues. And of course, there are some developments that it's better that the government is at stake and not private parties. So it will be a mix-up, I think, and it used to be public authority only. but I think we will see a shift in working more together on, working more together.
Professor Nash?
Yes, it's an interesting question. In Britain, city authorities, certainly maybe with the exception of London, where we have a different structure, city authorities have not played that important a role in public transport in recent years. So, as I say, a lot of bus services are provided by the private sector on a purely commercial basis. Rail services are largely franchised by central government. So the city authorities don't have that strong a role. Now, what has happened during the pandemic is central government has set down the rules, for instance, on social distancing, and to a fair extent, it's been the individual transport operators who have then had to interpret those rules on what exactly they mean in terms of what capacity they can make available, to what extent they have to restrict numbers on their vehicles. And I think that has led to a confusing situation where different operators have different rules, even down to where you can sit. So on some buses, you're supposed to sit in a window seat. On others, you're supposed to alternate between the window and the aisle seat, and so on. So I think we've had a lack of clarity in the way that it's been done in Britain, and I think it would be a lot clearer if city authorities had more authority. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's already a trend to moving towards more of a franchising or concessioning system. Cities can now do that. There's also a trend towards more decentralisation of decisions on rail franchises. So I think we are going in the direction of giving city authorities a lot more authority over public transport, and I think that's very much needed.
Thank you for that response. We have another question that's related to the impacts the pandemic has had on increasing the private cars modal share. The question is, to reduce congestion, do you expect much more aggressive use of time of day pricing?
Sorry, which should start?
Professor Nash, maybe you can go first, and then Floris, you can reflect as well.
Yeah. As I said, I mean, the big worry at present is that we are going to see more use of cars as we get more back to normal, that confidence in public transport has been reduced, capacity has been reduced. So yes, I would expect in the short run to see congestion worsening. Now, the government has been taking the view that it does not want to see more use of congestion charging. For many years now, it hasn't increased taxes on motoring, even in line with inflation. So there's really been no use of pricing as a way of controlling congestion. I do think that will change. I think it will change for a number of reasons, with the growth of electric cars, the current system of charging motors, which is basically through fuel tax, collapses. So the income to the Treasury from fuel taxes is steadily going down from motoring. The government is in the process of preparing a transport decarbonisation plan. Now, it has said that it wishes to see public transport being the mode of transport of choice for most people, which is a dramatic change on the past. So I think, again, there were changes already happening in terms of transport policy, and this pandemic will accelerate them and make the introduction of more congestion charging more urgent.
Yeah, Chris, if I can just add I think it's well said. I think the same is true in the Netherlands. I think it's pricing is very political, hot topic and sensitive topic. And this situation has always also shown us that there is much more possible. You know, people say, hey, I can't work on different hours, or I can't work from home. That's not possible. Well, let's see what we're doing right now. And I think a lot of people watching this series are doing the same. I think pricing is a good option, but it should not be the only solution. I think the integrated approach, if we work together with a lot of employers and the things I mentioned in my presentation, is needed to get that total system working. And of course, you can have the pricing in place, but that means some people just have to go during rush hours to their work for one reason or the other. And is that fair? Well, it is fair if you provide different alternatives, like working from home or different transport modalities, that people, don't go en masse in their cars during rush hours, but make different choices. So it should be an integrated approach.
Thank you to both of you. Another question that we've just received is a very interesting one. Is that since the pandemic has sort of shifted the focus towards more private transport, and as the pandemic eases and as things go back to the original normal as much as they would, what should governments do to attract people back to public transport? Is there a long-term role for public transport going in the future? Professor Nash?
Yeah, I think the first essential, and it's really probably the operators rather than public transport, got to do this, is to build up confidence in public transport again. As I say, the big problem for us at present remains capacity. The more they can do to restore capacity, the better. That again raises the big question of whether, if everyone's wearing a mask, you can ease the rules on capacity constraints further. One thing that bus operators and train operators have been doing is to provide better real-time information on whether buses or trains are full, and that's very helpful. You can actually find, I shouldn't try it. The 8:45, that's already full, but the 8:55 has empty seats. That's helpful. The operators themselves have been introducing much more intensive cleaning regimes and have been widely advertising that. I think once the capacity problem ceases to be as acute as it still is, we need to see a big effort by both government and public transport to promote public transport again, and clearly that get mixed up again with the longer term issues about wishing to promote public transport because of the decarbonisation policies. So that undoubtedly, I would say, means devoting more money to public transport as well.
Thank you, Floris.
Well, that's my personal view. I personally believe this will be a temporarily impact in a way, because maybe in a year or maybe quicker we have a vaccine, and of course a lot of people think, okay, maybe the train is not the best option, or the bus. I prefer my private car. But in the end, what I was referring in my presentation to those 4 layers. And public transport is just very needed and very important to have, because you need those mass transportation modes. You need them, So in the end, it's of course the better the service, the better the information. Of course, that all helps. But for the first, maybe next year or maybe half year, we're just not really entitled or allowed to go into that public transport. And what you see in the Netherlands, those passenger numbers are already rising to an extent that it's more the opposite. How do we make sure that for a very short period of time we have alternatives for people, because actually due to less capacity, trains or buses are full. So I don't see there. Well, I think it's essential to have public transport in place also for the long run. And I think there is a role for the government to support those public transport operators to to get those lines in place for the time needed.
Thank you both. We have another question that's related. This is from Panjak, who's asking what kind of data can be used to influence this behavioral change? Professor Nash, do you want to go first and Floris then second?
Yep.
Sounds very much more Floris's field than mine, but in terms of data, actually, I think public transport data is not bad as it stands. Normally, ticket machines produce immediate electronic data. Online bookings obviously do. And new forms of data like data from mobile phones are useful for some purposes, but that actually don't give the same sort of detail as you get generally from existing sources of data. Where the problem in data has always been the private car. And given that we're trying to attract people out of private cars, obviously that's a significant gap, and that is where new forms of data, mobile phone data, for instance, may be valuable in terms of giving us better information on the actual flows. But for a lot of purposes, we need a level of data, a level of information about the people, the purposes of their journey, the alternatives they face, that none of these sources produce. So we're, to my mind, we still have a very major need of survey data. Of course, again, surveys are improved because of the use of electronic systems, but in a way, I don't think the need for surveys has yet changed very much. But as I say, I'm sure, Floris, this is much more your subject than mine.
Well, yeah. I don't know whether I'm more capable of answering these questions, but to my opinion, data is key, and I think the more we know about the people themselves, the end users, the better we can have a on-demand or mobility system, transport system that really fulfills the end users' needs best. And of course, it's very important to make sure that privacy and all those things will be guaranteed. Well, that's at least important for in the Netherlands, and I think the same is in the UK. But I think data is key, but also the quality of that data is key, because you can have much data, but I think the quality of the data is as important. And the more we know about our users of the public transport, but also of the mobility system, the better we are capable of having the best journey and traffic journey possible. So that's my opinion. And a lot of things are going on regarding data in the Netherlands. That's one of the most important keys to have a more resilient system in place. Yeah.
Thank you both of you for this. And let me pose the last question, and I'd request both of you to be a little brief. It's an interesting question, but we'll run out of time. So the question is that in this situation where governments are directing public providers to, and particularly in developing countries, and capping of fares, so that because of the impact on the urban poor or poor who use, or the middle class who uses these public transport. Where do you see this going? Where there is a capping of fares, and at the same time, the public providers are facing huge problems and losses in terms of having lost the capacity. So where do we go from here? Floris, you start, and then we'll give Professor Nash the last word.
Well, in the end, that's a political answer, I suppose. I think my personal view is I think you need a system in place that is inclusive and for everyone. But I think the better, and that data helps with that as well, the better you know your customers and your clients, the better you can have a solution in place that fulfills everyone needs best. Because you don't always have to take a train or a tram or a metro or a bus. There are other options, what I was mentioning before. And I think a basic system needs to be in place and needs to be inclusive and available for everyone. But we should not only think in buses and trains and those mass systems, but also on-demand systems. Because when you don't have that much money, but your neighbor is able to, well, you can drive along with your neighbor because you have a smart app that knows that your neighbor is going to that sort of place as well. And you can drive along for free. That's also an option. So I think we should have a wider view on what is needed, and that's more than just capping the fares for mass transport. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, in part, as I mentioned already, I think there remains a need to make motoring more expensive, and if that's done through taxes and charges, that will produce some revenue which can be used to help in the public transport sector. But also, I think that there is a problem that whilst clearly there are people for whom public transport fares are currently a big problem in terms of affordability, I've worked in developing countries quite a bit, and I've seen systems where the fares are held very low and therefore there's not much money to provide services, and you end up with a very poor quality of service, which drives people to get a car as soon as they possibly can. And that clearly is not a good outcome. So I think that there are some difficult trade-offs to be made that public transport users certainly have to contribute to the costs of the system, and maybe more can be done to provide specific assistance for those who are so poor that public transport fares are a big problem for them. So I think, again, it is a case of integrated planning, which I think Floris has been emphasizing, and I would agree.
No, thank you both. Thank you to both of you, and thank you to all the participants for a very interactive session. I think this is, I've attended a few of these before, and I think this is one of the ones where we had a lot of good questions. So thank you very much for your participation. And I'd like to invite you, all of you who are on this session, that next week, same time next week, we'll have a session on healthy cities. This is a continuation of the work that WHO and others had started almost 2 decades ago on healthy cities. And then with there was complacency, and then suddenly now we are faced with this pandemic. So this whole issue of healthy cities is coming back. And so please do come and join, and we'll send out the invitations as we do always through the network. So thank you very much. And Caroline, do you want to say something, and we can close that?
Thank you to Professor Nash and for sharing your experience, and for the participants for joining us today.
Okay, so thank you very much, and good night, good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.